Of the most hotly contested regions on the planet, the South China Sea.
We are learning that images taken of the spy balloons.
So this is out of a dystopian science fiction novel.
The Chinese Communist Party is inside the gates.
It comes from China.
If you are a Western English speaker, you're probably more than aware of the West's criticism of China. The media these days feels saturated with criticisms of how China is a threat to Western liberal values. Values that are, more often than not, left pretty vague, but that's another story. However, you're probably less aware of what China says about the West. Well, in February 2023, the Foreign Ministry of the People's Republic of China released a document online in English called US Hegemony and Its Perils. In this document, the Foreign Ministry laid out in quite a lot of detail exactly what its critique of America and American imperialism is. So I thought it might be worth taking a look. Now I know that probably in the comments down below after this video there's going to be a lot of people accusing me of being a Chinese shell just for engaging with this document in good faith. However, the purpose of this video is not to convince you whether China is good or bad or somewhere in between. No, instead I think it's just important that we are all more aware of what China, one of the world's largest economies with a population of 1.4 billion, is saying about its greatest geopolitical rival. I think even if you're China's #1 hater, you should be interested in learning more about that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down this document, telling you exactly what the arguments are, adding a little bit more context, and then bringing it all in for a conclusion at the end. As always, if you like this video, please think about liking, sharing and subscribing. And if you have your own thoughts, please put them down in the comments below. I will leave a link to the document itself in the description so that if you want to find out more, you can follow the link and have a read yourself. Okay, let's get started.
Brought to you courtesy of the red, white and blue.
This document breaks US hegemony down into 5 distinct categories: political, military, economic, technological and cultural. The first is political, and I think it's actually one of the stronger sections of the document. The main opinion of this section of the document is that the United States is the political hegemon of our world, and that countries that wish to act independently of the US will find it very difficult indeed. The document traces the beginnings of this political hegemony all the way back to the 19th century Monroe Doctrine, which positioned rhetorically the United States in opposition to European exploitation of the Americas, but in actuality just positioned America as the preeminent colonial power within the Western Hemisphere. And China's claim here is that this political domination, masquerading as anti-colonialism, never really ended, but instead was just updated to something they call the Neo-Monroe Doctrine, and spread away from the Western Hemisphere into Africa and Eurasia. About Latin America specifically, the document states that, from its 61-year hostility toward the blockade of Cuba to its overthrow of the Allende government in Chile, US policy on this region has been built on one maxim: those who submit will prosper, those who resist shall perish. The document here quotes liberally from former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's memoir, Never Give an Inch, to prove that this kind of regime change interference in South America has support at the highest levels of US government. The document also talks about America's involvement in the Arab Spring protests and the various colour revolutions that pepper the post-Soviet world, as evidence of the fact that America's Neo-Monroe Doctrine has spread long past the boundaries of the Americas. The point here is not even so much that this kind of political interference is bad, although of course the Chinese government thinks it is, but merely to prove that it is happening. With these points of evidence, it's pretty much irrefutable that America exercises a level of political hegemony that other countries simply cannot match. Only America can get involved in every corner of every continent, seemingly at will. But of course the US does not simply come out and say, oh, we're just going to get politically involved in countries all around the world to promote our own interests. No, instead US officials will talk about things like the rules-based international order or supporting international law. And indeed, the State Department's criticism of what are seen as enemy nations is often that these nations, unlike the US or their Western allies, do not follow these rules. We see here America's vision of itself as global policeman, referee to the game of geopolitics. And the document does really well to bring receipts here to prove that this is pure hypocrisy. citing the recent US unilateral withdrawal from the UN Population Fund, UNESCO and the Paris Agreement in 2017, the UN Human Rights Council in 2018, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019, and the Treaty on Open Skies in 2020, as well as a continuing stumble block to the Biological Weapons Convention, as evidence that when the US doesn't like what's happening, it will take the ball and go home. And you can't really say that you support international law if you only follow the laws that you like. I suppose all of this could be summarised in a term that Caroline Elkins uses to describe British liberal imperialism of the 19th and 20th century. Legalised lawlessness. That is to say that Western imperialism has always felt the need to justify itself in terms of following the law, even while its representatives on the ground behave in a manner that is altogether pretty lawless. Let's use an example of this legalised lawlessness in the case of the United States. America is not a party to the International Criminal Court, and in 2002 passed a law called the Armed Service Members Protection Act, which gave the government the right to resist ICC investigations of American citizens up to and including invading The Hague, and was supported with broad bipartisan consensus, including by the votes of the then Senator and now President Joseph Biden. So international bodies have no oversight of the US and treaties are not binding upon it. Why? Well, as this document states, it is because America has complete political hegemony all across the globe, and as such, there is no counterbalance to what it wants to do. What this means is it creates a circumstance in which America can basically do what it wants, and there are no consequences. And we cannot really call that a lawful state. What this means in practice is the United States only needs to follow international law when and if it feels like it, which is not really how laws are meant to work.
I got a letter from LBJ, it said this is your lucky day, it's time to put your khaki trousers on.
The claim that America has military hegemony is fairly uncontroversial. If you go online, it's not hard to find maps or memes charting some of America's over 800 foreign military bases. Yet for me, this section in the document about America's military hegemony is one of the weakest. And this is due to the way that the document lays out its argument.
The argument goes something like this: that America, from its inception in 1776 right up till the present day, is an inherently expansionist power, and that military power is a key component of that expansion. The document estimates that America has been involved in something approaching 400 military interventions in its long history. And the War on Terror comes in for specific criticism as a particularly egregious case of unlawful behaviour by the US military. Now, if you've spent any time in left-wing spaces, you'll be pretty aware of a lot of these arguments. But I actually think that the weakness here is that the document does not make a clear distinction between the wars and military interventions that the US has initiated. The US has been involved in a lot of wars in its long history, but not all of these wars are the same. And putting them all together, as this document does, weakens the analysis. Let me unpack this a little. The US is an expansionist power, but the nature of that expansion has changed over the years. For example, after the Mexican-American War, or the Indian Wars, or the Spanish-American War, the US would literally expand its global geographical footprint. But even at the height of the Iraq War, there was no possibility that Iraq would become a permanent territory of the US like Guam or Puerto Rico. This is because during the 20th century, Western imperial powers came to realise that having a formal colony was not necessarily desirable. Colonies tended to be expensive to run and left you open to criticism if you needed to crack down on the natives. Far better to have a semi-colonial relationship. This is where, rather than running a whole colony, such as the British in India, you instead controlled key nodes of the local economy and leave a pliant native elite to manage the less profitable sections of the neo-colony. We can see this being tried out in somewhere like China in the 19th and early 20th centuries, where various colonial powers dominated the rich commercial hubs along the coast, but left the Qing Empire to manage the interior. This strategy really reached its apex for the US in its control of Latin America and the Pacific in the 20th century. Far easier to just train and supply the local enforcers than bear the cost of an indefinite colonial expansion. Now obviously this does not mean that America is never involved in wars. Occasionally throughout the 20th century, America has been pulled into pretty bloody wars to protect its neo-colonial elites in the global south, most notably with Korea and Vietnam. And when the US does get pulled into wars like in Vietnam or Korea, it is to protect a local pro-American, pro-capital elite from an enemy that they themselves cannot quite defeat on their own. And to be clear, these neo-colonial wars of the 20th century are no less bloody than the colonial wars of the 19th. China's century of humiliation was its most bloody in its long history, and the Vietnam War killed millions. But they are different from the colonial expansive wars of the American West, for instance. And not recognising this fact weakens our analysis of how imperialism, colonialism and military hegemony works in the 21st century.
Money, money, money must be funny in the rich man's world.
The modern economic system as we know it was born in Bretton Woods in 1944. This is where international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF had their birth. The Bretton Woods system would be, among other things, a great boon for American economic hegemony, as it would establish the dollar as the global reserve currency. Now, if you want to learn more about dollar supremacy, I would recommend checking out the work of someone like Ben Norton over at Geopolitical Economy Report, who has done excellent work on dollar imperialism. But basically, being the global reserve currency means that key commodities like oil must be valued in the US dollar, giving America unique and unparalleled economic power. And for China, there are two main problems with this US dollar supremacy. The first is that the US uses its position as the economic hegemon to beat down economic rivals. The example used in this document is the 1985 Plaza Accords. So, in the early 1980s, Japan looked set to outstrip America as a manufacturing base. By 1985, the strength of the dollar relative to the Japanese yen was putting real pressure on US manufacturing as Japanese goods could be imported cheaply. This led to large companies like IBM and Caterpillar to lobby Congress. In September 1985, the G5 nations met in the Plaza Hotel in New York. The agreement basically led to Japan agreeing to destroy its own currency. This led to the lost decade and the end of Japan as a serious economic rival to the US. There is no reason for the Plaza Accords other than to save US manufacturing. And one of the main reasons that the US was able to convince a nominal sovereign country to kneecap its own manufacturing base was because of the US's ability to control the levers of the global economy. There are of course other examples, but Japan is a particularly salient one. For Japan has been, since the end of the Second World War, been America's at least nominal ally. And the fact that the American elite and its economic power brokers were willing to put the squeeze in Japan proves that they'll really do anything. I mean, if you're willing to make one of your key allies in the Pacific commit economic suicide, imagine what you would do to your enemies. The second major concern from China about US economic hegemony is sanctions. Now, any country can stop trading with another, but the US is unique in being able to stop third parties trading with its rivals. Let's take Cuba as an example. Pretty much every country on earth thinks that the Cuban blockade should end. And I'm not exaggerating here. The last time it came up for a vote in the UN, only the US and Israel voted to continue the sanctions. This means that even America's very closest allies, like the UK, France and Germany, believe that these sanctions are unlawful. But the opinion of the rest of the world does not matter, as the US controls the levers of the global economy. And I want to stress how wide-ranging these sanctions are. If you are a European country that wants to do business in Cuba, you run the risk of falling foul of US sanctions, even although your home country explicitly disagrees with the fairness of these sanctions. So US sanctions aren't just saying, we will no longer trade with you, but are telling the global community to submit to the decision made within the US. And submit they do, because even if other countries find the sanctions wrong or unjust, there isn't all that much they can do about it. The US uses its status as the global economic hegemon to pursue its own narrow economic interests. It should be clear why countries as diverse as China, Brazil and Saudi Arabia are increasingly chafing under this regime. For instance, recently President Lula of Brazil has come out strongly for the idea of a South American reserve currency to challenge the US dollar. And China is increasingly beginning to trade with countries like Russia in RMB, cutting out the US middleman. It remains to be seen how the US regime will react to these developments. But if history is any judge, the reaction will probably not be a particularly constructive one.
They took the credit for your second symphony, rewritten by machine on new technology.
Technological hegemony is not something I see talked about all that much in the West. Perhaps because the technology we use is very much like the air we breathe. We don't really think about it. But for countries like China and others in the global south, it is increasingly a sore point, and one that they are really interested in bringing up in documents like these. The US at first used its economic hegemony to become the preeminent power when it came to technology. And now, when that power is being challenged by places like China, it is again using that economic hegemony to try and remain the number one dog. We can see that with recent US elite hysteria over things like TikTok and Huawei, or the increasingly restrictive visas for Chinese students trying to pursue science degrees in America. This is of course worrying for China, who, as they are just beginning to develop their own tech sector, is increasingly concerned that the US is going to try and kneecap it, as it has done to other countries like Japan. US hypocrisy again comes in for criticism in this section, with China labelling America the empire of hackers, calling out America for its well-documented spying on both allies and competitors, and the vast reach of the national security state into things as banal as Facebook or Twitter. Much as in the economic sphere, the US government acts as an enforcer for US tech companies' control of market share. And in return, these tech companies roll over to help serve the national security state. We can see an example of this most recently as national security and former national security officials will leave to take up prominent jobs in places like Facebook. I thought this was a particularly strong section, and you should really read it yourself, especially if you've not been closely following the developments of national security officials embedding themselves within social media, or the use of social media companies to increasingly silence distant voices online. So the cultural hegemony section was actually a very disappointing section for me, and probably the weakest overall section in this document. The document begins with a talk about how the movie market is completely saturated with American products, with something like 70% of products being of American origin, and how this complete domination of the market by American movies has a real effect on the imagination of what is possible. That is to say, that the American elite, by dominating our imagination, can control what worlds we want to build. And while all of this is true, after a couple of sentences the document just kind of moves on. Now I think this would have been an excellent opportunity to really dive into the role of American cultural industry in the promotion of American imperialism. Perhaps we could have talked about the struggles of Chinese movie industry to break into foreign markets, or China's attempt to revitalise Chinese culture in the face of Western saturation. But instead, we very quickly move on, and I think this really is an opportunity missed. For the rest of this section is mostly about social media, about how social media is used to spread information into rival countries, and how dissenting voices are silenced, meaning Westerners rarely get the opportunity to hear from the other side. This is, of course, true, but I don't really see why it is in the culture section and not the technology section. I would have rather seen some discussion on the prevalence of anti-communist or Islamophobic tropes in popular Western TV shows and films, or even something like the role of big-budget movies in promoting imperial adventures abroad or the American capitalist lifestyle. But instead, we obsess over Twitter and TikTok. Overall, this section was a bit of a disappointment to me, if I'm honest. Not really because I disagreed with anything that was said, but because I thought it was a giant opportunity wasted. We really need to grapple with how the American cultural industry dominates our imagination and controls the kind of worlds we think are possible. This is a real problem, and yet this section instead obsesses over Twitter. At the end of the day, Twitter is not real life. China concludes by stating that it is opposed to all hegemony, and condemns external influences in foreign countries. It calls on future relationships to be built through dialogue and partnership, and kind of politely asks America to reflect on its history and its current hegemonic position. And I think this is actually an admirable aim. I think we should be building relationships built on mutual understanding, dialogue and partnership, both on the international level, within our own communities and on an individual basis. Now you could argue, of course, that China as a rising power has every incentive to argue for a future in which the US does not dominate the globe. And you would be right. But US global imperial hegemony is no less bloody because its critics have a vested interest in seeing its end. And if China can push us a little bit closer to a world in which other countries are treated as sovereign, and international law and rules-based international order is not just a smokescreen for pretty lawless behaviour on the part of imperial powers, well, more power to them. But I do have some serious problems with this document. The main one is that it is just really badly sourced. Like, for instance, at one point it claims that the War on Terror claimed over 900,000 lives, but it's really unclear where this number came from. I've seen various different estimates of how many people died in the wars in Iraq or the wars on terror in general, and 900,000 seems a bit of a lowball. It would be interesting to know where the Foreign Ministry of China was getting this number, but as there is no reference, I am left in the dark. And I think this is a real shame, because overall I actually agree with most of the major points within this document. I think if you went into the reading of this document a committed defender of US imperialism, you would not leave it convinced of the errors of your ways. But then I suppose it is not really the role of China to convince us Westerners that our own imperialism is a problem in the world. What this document is useful for, though, is stating out what China's position on the world stage is. Despite its problems, it is an interesting insight into the thinking of the Chinese leadership about what China's role will be as the 21st century progresses. And so far, from what I've read in this document, I am pleasantly surprised. There is a commitment to a rules-based international order, to the respect of the sovereignty of other countries, and to the building of dialogue built on partnership. I hope that, unlike Europe and America, China sticks to its words. Anyway, if you want to read the document yourself, and I really recommend that you do, I will leave a link to it in the show notes. If you like what you saw today, please give me a like, a share and a subscribe. And please tell me what you thought of this document and this video in the comments down below.
When Lyndon Johnson told the nation, have no fear of escalation, I am trying everyone to please. Though it isn't really war, we're sending 50,000 more to help save Vietnam from Vietnamese.